Welcome to the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. We've got a special for you today, you know. Oh, yes, we have. Not just because Tim Vickery is in Rio dressed in. Is that a gilet, as the French would say?
No, it's not at all. It's a piece of Italian knitwear, modelled very, very closely on something that DiCaprio wears in Catch Me If You Can.
Oi,
You
mate,
might remember
you
the
are
scene.
not
His is
Leonardo
much more.
DiCaprio.
No, and one day in his dreams he'll be me. You might remember from the original. It's orange and white. I thought that was a little bit kind of da 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 da. So I went for a more muted color scheme. There's a scene in the film when he's having a party. There's that party that's going on. And one of his mates nearly spills alcohol over his top, and he just yells at them and says, "It's Italian, so don't be going spilling water over my top now."
I wouldn't dream of it. Not when we've got two very special guests with us. Darren Lewis, a friend of the programmes on the pod as well, I should say, from the Daily Mirror, football columnist there, or sports columnist generally. Darren, what a pleasure it is to have you on the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast, mate.
It's a real pleasure to join you again. I'm a big fan of you both. So for me, it's a labour of love.
Good. I like it. Without the politics now, you get what I mean, Dan. Dan Bardell's with us. And not only are you a broadcaster, you're a villain. You're a villain.
I am. Not like a nasty person, like a Villa fan, just to clarify.
No, let's go for the villains. You call yourself villains. It's like
I know.
It's on that Ice Cube track on his first solo album after he got, he walked out of NWA, but some would say he got kicked out of it. And Ice Cube's he's got this track. It's something about don't ever trust certain ladies from the ghetto, basically. Anyway, he goes back. He meets this girl, and he goes to her family, and they're all sort of drug dealers and everything. Anyway, they get raided, and he goes up in court, and he's wearing a T-shirt saying he is dope. And the judge says, mate, you can't go down. You can't walk in here saying you're dope. But of course, dope meant something else in the old days. I went off on a sidetrack there. You're on your honeymoon as well, Dan.
Well, yes, I mean, people are going to think, why is he sat in his office on a honeymoon on his own? But I did get married on Monday, so we haven't booked a honeymoon just yet because Villa, very annoyingly for my now wife, got to an FA Cup semi-final at the weekend, so that took priority. But we will go away. But Wembley is the honeymoon as it stands.
At least you've set your stall out from very early on. Villa first.
She's aware. Yeah. She's been aware for a long time. Yeah,
good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, the big debate is whether this season has been the worst season ever, or perhaps the best season ever, or something in between. Who wants to kick off? Darren, first of all, you're the man of the press. Best, worst. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention you're a Scouser. Nobody could tell that from your accent, obviously.
I was actually born in Bootle.
Well, yeah, legit then. I apologise. I take it all back. Tim, next time,
tell me. Don't worry, Dotun. I was joking. Oh, no.
But you are a red. You are a red.
I am a red. I'm a red because I was a big fan of the legendary John Barnes in the 80s when he played for Watford. And I was a starry-eyed teenager. And then when he moved to Liverpool, I followed him across and I've supported Liverpool ever since. And I would imagine it's a very similar story for lots of men of my age, of a certain age, in terms of where their support for Liverpool goes back to. I very seldom talk about it, actually, because obviously when you're in the media, you want to be objective, and lots of people kind of mistake you revealing your allegiance to a club for your being staunchly one-eyed in terms of your support against them and won't have a word said against them, whereas that's not the case. But if you're asking me in terms of the season and where it stands, I wouldn't say it's the worst. I wouldn't say it's the best. I'd say it's been a really entertaining in-between season. And yes, we have had dominant winners of the Premier League before at a very early stage. But what we haven't had too often is a race for a Champions League place, which involves five different clubs, I should say. I would bring in actually Bournemouth and Fulham below them at the time of us recording this, who are in 8th and 9th, because you can never obviously account for any kind of implosion with just a few games to go, and mathematically they could do it if they put a decent run together. But I just feel that the top two clubs, Arsenal were second last season, they're second again. Liverpool have improved beyond the points total they had at this stage last season, and they've been entertaining to watch and consistent. I think that there's been a democratization of the Premier League. Other teams outside of the top four have really spent sensibly, and that investment is now being brought to bear because the competitiveness of the Premier League is really continuing to outdo other leagues around the world, which is why, and I know Tim will speak to this, in some cases, in territories where you would expect people to be big fans of the local football, the country's football, they are big fans of the Premier League. So I would not say that this has been a poor season. I would say that, just one last thing, we have had poor decision-making at the bottom of the Premier League. Clubs that have come up have had managers that naively have tried to play a style of football that they are not equipped for. And they've forgotten all about the basic principle that when you come into the Premier League, you've got to win at any cost. And it might be ugly at times, but you've got to do what it takes to stay above that line. That's why those clubs have gone straight back down, not because they were not good enough to stay in the Premier League, because I do believe had they played differently, they would have stayed in the Premier League. But in general terms, I've been really entertained by this Premier League season.
Dan Bardell, I suppose, and apologies, we've got you on just hours after you suffered a devastating blow against Manchester City. I didn't want to remind you about that, but
No,
the last minute winners are the worst ones, aren't they? They are the flipping worst. There can be nothing worse than you thinking you're going to get a draw at the Etihad Stadium, and then a little known Belgian called Jeremy Doku comes, runs down the left-hand side faster than your defender. I'm not rubbing it in, honestly, but this is how the goal was scored. I'm not rubbing it in, and then crosses the ball in. And who knew? A player that had never scored before for Manchester City gets the winner against you. Good season or bad season?
Well, I think to point towards Villa and the Premier League in general, I think I'm quite fortunate at the moment because I support a team who have something to play for going into the business end of the season, whereas a lot of the stuff, as you've just discussed, is cut and dry. I think I agreed with a lot with what's been said previously. I think the little disappointment for me, probably across the entirety of the Premier League, has been the relegated teams that were just spoken about, and then probably Arsenal. I know they've had injuries, but you did feel if Man City were to drop off, and of course, no one saw the drop off that Manchester City have gone on to have this season. Nobody saw that coming. You did always think it would be Arsenal that would capitalise, and I did think at the start of the season that this might be Arsenal's year, and as it turns out, it still might be with the Champions League. Obviously, they've progressed to the semi-finals of that competition, and they're now managing the Premier League and the Champions League with obviously a bigger eye on the Champions League. But it's a shame that they're in that position because I don't think it would have taken much to get a little bit tighter to Liverpool, a little bit closer to Liverpool. So I think the lack of a title race has been the thing that's disappointed me most, because I think Arsenal have let themselves down at times. I'm a big fan of Arteta, and I've really enjoyed what he's done at Arsenal, the way he's galvanised the club, and the whole club pulls in the same direction now, including the fan base, which I think has been a difficult thing to do post-Wenger or even in the latter years of Wenger's tenure. But they've gone backwards in the Premier League this season, despite going forwards in the Champions League. So I guess that's probably my biggest disappointment. But we've spoke about the strength of the rest in the Premier League, and the teams like Bournemouth and Fulham on any given day, those teams can be tricky for any Premier League team to go to. And we've seen that many times this season with Manchester City and other teams travelling to those places and not picking up points. So although it may not have been the most exciting season, in some ways, the Premier League is still actually stronger than it's ever been.
I suppose, Tim, that both Dan and Darren that points out the dichotomy in what they're saying. Because on the one hand, Premier League, yeah, Liverpool have won it and have won it for months and months and months and months. Yeah, all the focus on the Champions League or Europe in general, where possible 10 English teams could be in Europe next season, all that focus is distracted away. Whereas what Darren said earlier on, said, look, the whole world wants to watch the Premier League. We're watching Europe. No, we're not. We're watching the Premier League, and all we should be. That is where the competition should be, really, shouldn't it? If we talk about a great season or lackluster season.
Big mate of mine, a great football journalist over here in Rio, he came up the line once. We were watching a terrible game between two awful teams, but it was fabulous. And he said, you know what? The great thing about football is it doesn't have to be good to be good. And that's just as well, because, you know, if it had to be good, teams in the lower divisions wouldn't get anyone watching them. So I think you can make a distinction between quality and excitement. And for the reasons that both Dan and Darren have mentioned, there has been a lack of excitement at both ends of the Premier League, isn't there? With Liverpool wrapping things up really by March, and no relegation dogfight we've known very early. So there's been a lack of excitement there. But I would probably take the view that in general the overall standard is very high. I think we see this when Darren mentioned it, the promoted teams. Now, what they tried to do is replicate what they'd done in order to get promoted. And all of them have found out that they just couldn't do it. I mean, they weren't playing badly early season. But, you know, you're up against a strength of opposition. You really feel this in the Premier League with the power to acquire players that these clubs have. That, you know, even if the newly promoted teams play really well, last 20 minutes, the opposition can bring on 3 or 4, 30 million pound players and win the game there. So I think it's precisely the struggles of the newly promoted teams that tells you how strong the Premier League is. Now, there's a couple of caveats to that. One is obviously, as Dan has mentioned, Arsenal. We all expected more from Arsenal, I think, in the Premier League. The City drop off, personally, I don't find it as surprising. I never thought that they would retain the title. Liverpool have to be the guy after the guy is really hard, and he's made it look easy. And this points, I think, to one of the great strengths of the Premier League these days, with some exceptions, which is how well a lot of these clubs are run. You know, and the choice of coaches is often brilliant, isn't it? I mean, Slot, who on earth is this guy? And look what he's done. You know, and we've seen this over the last few years. Now, when De Zerbi came in, who's this guy? You know, they're people. So the Premier League clubs are obviously doing their homework sensationally well to fight Iraola at Bournemouth. No, it's sensational the way that the clubs are capable of bringing in really top quality managers, and there are exceptions to this. And I think we've let some dangerous forces into the game with ownership structures, and obviously two of them, the massive exceptions here are Man United and Tottenham, where United, I think, it's a shambles because the whole club is designed to extract money for the owners. That I think is what Manchester United are now all about. And Tottenham are seen as a joke by many on the field, but inside the industry, they're seen as a reference for how much money they make and how low the wages are. So they are, I think, there's some dangerous forces that we've let in. But overall, a lot of the money that is in the Premier League is being spent very wise. I mean, clubs like Bournemouth, Fulham, Brentford, for crying out loud. And go back 20 years, we never expected these clubs to be in the top division, let alone playing so well in the top division. So I think the progress of those clubs is a testament to the fact that a lot of the money that comes into the Premier League is being wisely spent.
Yeah, there are quite a few Tottenham jokes. I'm looking at one or two here, and we'll get back to those later on.
Sure,
But
you will.
Darren, yeah, but Darren,
But very interesting. What Darren mentioned about his reluctance to out himself as a Liverpool fan. I find this very interesting. I think this in sports media, this is a real challenge these days in the era of social media, because so many of the people who will have a go at Darren for being a Liverpool fan, and you're biased towards Liverpool, what they are doing is they are projecting their own lack of emotional balance onto you. They think that you have the same, because the people who are shouting the loudest are usually the most emotionally unbalanced, and they're projecting their own lack of emotional balance onto you. And I think there's a real danger in sports media that our subjects are sometimes being determined by the loudest and the stupidest voices on social media. I see this as a huge challenge for our industry.
But that's no different from a news journalist, is it? At the BBC, people are, the corporation itself, let alone the people that work for it, always being considered to be left-wing, biased one way or another.
Yeah, but there's a huge difference, which is you don't have a general election every Wednesday and Sunday.
Fair point.
You do have a game of football. So the anti is.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, though, despite that, you do have a news story every single day that you cover. Imagine getting that level of, as for example, I know the one or two of my colleagues got, one in particular. I mean, I went away for one, just to sort of navigate this landscape very briefly. I went away to a completely different kind of social group once, and somebody said to me, "Oh, you work at the BBC?" And of course, yeah, that person is biased. You can see that she hates the Tories, this, that, and the other. And anyway, let me just put that out there. What I was going to say, though, Darren, what Dan said earlier on about Arsenal, and that Tim has picked up on as well, begs the question for you as a newspaper journalist. How different do you think the season would have been if Arsenal had mounted the competition that both Dan and Tim have alluded to? How different? Because I imagine, as Tim says, you look at the bottom teams and see how well they perform to sort of evaluate the strength of the season. But you can do it the other way around as well. I imagine that if Arsenal had been really on it this season, if they hadn't suffered the injuries, etc., but if they'd been really on it this season, the other teams would have been affected as well, one way or another.
Arsenal's quite an interesting subject, actually, because if you were to speak to an Arsenal fan now, I don't think they would be very unhappy with their season as a whole, in so much as they are in the latter stages of the Champions League, and the most free-scoring teams other than them in the Premier League are not. And it could well be because of the weird quirk of timing. Weird quirk, we always know where the Champions League is. But it often turns out that the team that gets to the Champions League final has the most attention around them. And if you win it, then you have the last laugh. Remember Liverpool not troubling the scorers in 2005, but enjoying their summer most because they went on to beat AC Milan in the Champions League final. And last summer, Mikel Arteta had a choice. Does he continue to strengthen his defence, the defence that cost him a couple of years ago when Saliba was injured and the team fell away in the business end of the campaign, or did he go for another striker? And instead, he continued to reinforce his defence in his midfield. Mourinho was certainly to English eyes, a fairly unremarkable player, even though he did have a lot of ability. As Tim was saying, sometimes in the English Premier League, when we don't see players or managers, we wonder what all the fuss is about. And time and again, it's for those players and those managers to show us what they can do. But I think as far as Arteta is concerned, any regrets he might have had over not investing in a striker instead have been offset by the fact that it is Arsenal's defence which has kept them so strong for so long in the Champions League. And I would argue that the results against Real Madrid, particularly the second leg at the Bernabeu, are as good as any result he has had in his entire time, including the FA Cup win at Arsenal. And we all know that football is about winning silverware, but I think lots of people expected Arsenal to be swept away by the star-studded, free-scoring Real Madrid attack. And instead, they kept them at arm's length, and they could have played for another 180 minutes and not scored against Arsenal. So I, at this stage of the season, don't feel as though Arteta will be beating himself up over not investing in a striker. Invariably, it is defences that win tournaments. Now, obviously, there'll be people listening to this, and you guys might point to me to occasions where teams without the best defence have won the league. But again, you know, I think as far as Arsenal are concerned, if they were to go on and win the Champions League because of that decision-making from Arteta, they'll have quite the summer.
Yeah, well, yeah, on that point, Dan, if Arsenal, well, it feels like from what Darren was saying there, that the title race is on. And I think, I mean, in terms of Arsenal supporters, certainly, and I do live with a couple. So, yeah, for my sins, you see, I wish I had your pain in terms of getting married. But let's put that to one side because my wife might be listening. They think, or at least they talk as if, I don't think they really believe that Arsenal are going to win the league at this ridiculously late stage. However, as far as they're concerned, it's not over yet, and they still reference Europe, etc. But I think Darren left us hanging with a carrot, which is what they're going to do over the summer. We, the public, want a title race. We do. It's always the case, isn't it? You say to any salesman, what's the best way to get a good price? Have two people bidding for the same thing, because it's going to go up and up and up and up and up. And we, the neutrals, watch and concentrate and focus when there are two. And like the same the other way around, when there's a relegation battle as well. In terms of the top 3 or 4, what's Arsenal got to do over the summer?
Could I just, before you answer, Dan, if I may, just come back and just one quick line. I actually think that the mark of any good season for me is a little bit like the mark of any good box set that we all watch. At the end of that particular season, you are left hanging. I wonder what's going to happen next season. And you look at the Premier League at the moment, and it isn't just Arsenal we expect to come back. Rodri alongside Gonzalez at Manchester City will form the most impenetrable shield and protection for the Manchester City back four. Marmoush alongside Haaland is going to be, it's almost like when we remember seeing Terminator 2 and the T-1000 after we'd seen Arnold Schwarzenegger enthrall us back in the day. Will Forest be as good next season as they were this season? Will Isak stay at Newcastle United? Will Aston Villa be even stronger next season and challenge for the title, given that they're storming into the race for the Champions League?
We're going to answer all those questions, hopefully, but let's start there.
That's the beauty. That's the beauty of why this has been such a good season, because it's almost it's taking shape again and regenerating into yet another entertaining entity, and that for me can only be a good thing.
Yeah, Unai Emery looked like he was in mortal pain when that Doku goal went in last night, though. Dan, where will Aston Villa be next season, do you think?
Well, I'm glad we've done this podcast today and not straight after the game, because I don't think I was feeling as reasonable straight after the game if I'd have had to have jumped on and done a pod straight away. I do think obviously Villa have got a chance of winning a trophy this season, which is the next step for any team. You get that first trophy, and I think a trophy, the FA Cup, would be a good barometer and a fair reflection of where Villa have been under Unai Emery, because the turnaround in the 2.5 years he's been there has been absolutely outstanding. From where Villa were when Steven Gerrard left to where they are now is night and day. And Villa were a good addition to the Champions League this season and ran aside PSG that could very well win it, very, very close across the two legs. The game last week was like nothing I've ever seen. It was an enthralling night at Villa Park. Villa, I think, have suffered this season because I don't think they had a brilliant summer. But what they did really well was they rectified it in January and built a squad that was ready to compete on three fronts in terms of trying to chase a Champions League place in the league, go as deep as they could in the Champions League and go as deep as they could in the FA Cup. So I think the Villa hierarchy and Unai Emery gave themselves the best chance in January with the transfer business that they did. And usually we all talk about how difficult January is. Villa actually showed that you can mould and reshape your squad quite well in January and give yourself a chance in the second half of the season. So I'm hoping, although we lost last night, we've been the form team in Europe up until last night. So we've been winning a lot of games in multiple competitions. If we can win the FA Cup, many teams start by winning a trophy of either the FA Cup or the League Cup. That's how many teams' journeys start. And they look back at that point and think, this is when it truly started. The next step for Villa is to try and kind of be in the title conversation, maybe up until a February or a March. I don't think it's feasible that Villa can go and win the league next season. I think at the moment there's only three teams that can challenge for the Premier League, and that's Arsenal, Manchester City and Liverpool. There's no reason why Villa can't try and put themselves on that step below the ladder, and they're probably already there to an extent, but they've built a squad now where they've got the size right. It just depends on what PSR does to them in the summer and if they can qualify for the Champions League again, because if they don't, they're probably going to have to sell a player. But what they have shown already is that they can navigate PSR, lose players, and actually make the squad stronger. So I've faith that next season Villa can be up and around the conversation for the Premier League.
What do you think of, and how do you think posterity will judge the loss of John Duran to Saudi Arabia? Because, you know, we've been inclined to think of the Saudi League as an elephant's graveyard. Over the last couple of years, they've been looking to buy up young South American talent direct from South America. But here, they got a potential superstar. And he's insanely talented, John Duran. And a player with everything ahead of him. How do you think we'll look back on that in a few years? Is this a decisive moment in the rise of Saudi football? Is this a moment when we think that maybe PSR is a hindrance? How do you think we're going to look back on the loss of Duran?
I think Villa would say that they didn't sell him due to PSR. It was more the fact that he wanted to go, and he was a little bit of a disruptive influence in the dressing room. There was a lot of problems with John Duran, but behind the scenes, obviously he had that purple patch where he was scoring a lot of goals. He was coming off the bench, and at the start of the season, Villa won a lot of games, including Champions League games, based on John Duran coming off the substitutes bench. But he seemed like he was a man in a hurry, and I felt he was in a good place at Villa. He's a young striker. He was working with a really, really good manager in a good environment. At the time, he had a striker that had been hot for 2-3 years in front of him. I think he just required a little bit of patience from John Duran, but he didn't have that. But my understanding is that as soon as the Saudi offer came in, that basically John Duran's motive was, I don't really care about where I'm playing my football. I care about where the money is, which is fine. And he went there because there was an awful lot of money on the table and he wanted to play every week. And I imagine playing with Cristiano Ronaldo is an attraction as well. But I kind of feel that since he's gone, because Villa have done well, no one's really talking about it. But I guess it also depends on, one, the success of the Saudi League, and two, if he ever does come back to Europe as that top striker, that one of the top forward playing in Europe, if that happens. But Villa will look at it and think, we made a huge profit on him. We got a very good price for someone that had come off the bench and scored a few goals in half a Premier League season. I actually think Villa would have been foolish to turn that money down.
I think there are lots of questions around Villa that I'd love to ask, but we haven't got the time for that.
Let's not make it about Villa.
No. I'm happy to. Genuinely, I'm happy to. But there are so many others. The enticing questions that you were asking a moment or two ago, Darren, I suppose the most intriguing for me is, where will Nottingham Forest be next season? As I've seen, and I've been raving about him from pretty early on, they've probably got one of the best centre-backs in the league of a Brazilian heritage. But you think, okay, you've started strong then, got a great keeper, And wow, if their centre forward if their centre forwards, let's bring both of them into the mix, but one in particular can continue as well next season as they've done this season, with those two wingers on either side, Ilanga, who seems to be the fastest race in the Premier League, or fastest horse in the Premier League maybe, and he's one of my own because I'm of kind of half Swedish heritage for all sorts of reasons. And then Hudson-Odoi over the other side, not to talk of Morgan Gibbs White, sorry, apologies. A senior moment. If they can continue with those players, anywhere near those players, surely it will be at least a 3-horse race next season.
I think we close ourselves off to the growth of the Premier League when we talk about 2- and 3-horse races, because you alluded earlier in the show to the fact that so many clubs now not only have the financial power, but they are spending money very wisely indeed. Aston Villa, to my mind, have constructed a fantastic squad. And if they can keep hold of, for example, Asensio and Rashford, and add some strikers to that squad, some defenders to that squad, defenders with leadership, because I think they did have a good defensive record for so long, but they've lost it at the wrong time. But I think it's defense rather than attack they need to build, and that's going to make them stronger. And I think in terms of the title race, there are now a number of teams that I think could take a hand in it, as you say, Dan, to around about February, March next year. Forest, I think, could be one of them, because the ownership is such that they don't have to sell players. They've got a really good, strong defensive base. Murillo and Milenkovic are two fabulous central defenders. Murillo in particular, I would not be surprised if some bigger clubs came in for him. But as I say, Marinakis won't be rolling over and allowing them to take him without a fight, and the price will be prohibitive. Matt Sells among those goalkeepers with the most clean sheets so far this season. And if you're asking me what they're going to do next year, it will all be based on how strong they are defensively. And I think they've built a really good defensive base to kind of progress from. I think they'll need more up front, because Chris Wood is I think he'll be 34 next year, even though he signed a new contract. He clearly isn't the future. But if they can deepen that squad, they've clearly moved away from the scattergun approach to transfers they used to have. I don't see any reason why they would not be in and around the European places at least.
They fascinate me more than anyone else, I think, next season. I think, Darren, you set it up beautifully, but all those narrative lines for next season, because it's a little bit like Godfather 3, isn't it? Our true enemy has not yet revealed himself. We don't have an outstanding candidate, and Liverpool going to be able to do it again. I don't know. But the Forest is the one that intrigues me, because the fixture congestion, just when I thought I was out, you pull me back in. They're going to have a fixture congestion with the Champions League. Injuries. Let's imagine that some of those centre-backs go down injured. Lord knows at Tottenham. We've seen what can happen with that. And the low block and counter-attack game, which is, there's something very retro about it. And it's been hugely, hugely successful. But obviously now they're going to be studied far, far more by opponents. They're going to be taken far more seriously by opponents. And there are risks defending close to your own goal. When it goes wrong, it can go wrong. So under the pressures that they're going to be under next year, I'm fascinated to see how the model that they've used this season will work next year.
Isn't it interesting, though, Dan, that when we talk about whether this season has been the best season or the worst season, whatever the season, and you know this as much as anybody else at Villa Park, but the season is predicated on the individual characters that we see. This is what makes the season for us. When Mo Salah burst onto the scene, it was like, wow, wow. And some of the naysayers who are saying, look, this season has been sort of like lackluster, pointing to the fact that Mo Salah's won everything this season. He's scoring for fun at his age. You know, that can't amount to a season of high quality is what the naysayers are saying, whatever we want to say about that. But I remember as well when Erling Haaland burst onto the scene. I mean, that first season, it was kind of like we were gobsmacked. We were like, wow, how many goals is this guy going to score? Is it all over? The other teams may as well pack off and go home because he's going to win the title. But even apart from those top players, it's the ones that come through. When Murillo came through, you looked at him and thought, oh my goodness, I think they've got a player here. And then
25 games in Brazil, 25 and out. Unbelievable.
Yeah. And he can take free kicks as well. You see, he keeps bringing something fresh and you're thinking, right, I won't forget that. It's another notch on the belt of how good this season has been. Which are the players this season that have perhaps caught your eye and have kept your interest, whether they be Villa players or players from elsewhere?
I think sometimes it's not just in individual players; it is teams. So Bournemouth and Fulham, two teams. I think the manager is actually the star rather than anyone in the team. I don't look at either of those teams and think there's a star there. It's the manager that makes them so good. I think of Iraola, for example, at Bournemouth. I think he could go into Ipswich with the same kind of players that are at Ipswich, and you gave him a bit of time. And I don't think Ipswich would be a million miles away from where Bournemouth are. So sometimes it's the managers there that do things and are the magic makers for certain teams. If I was to pick some players out, I think Morgan Gibbs-White is a player I really, really like. There was obviously a lot of fanfare around him with the last England squad that he wasn't called up initially. Every time I watch Forest, he's the heartbeat of that team. He's a number 10, but he works so hard for the team as well. I think he possesses a huge amount of quality. I think when Forest spent the money that they spent on him, there was a lot of eyebrows raised and people saying that they'd overspent. He's probably worth double what they paid for him at least at this point, and there'll be teams circling around him in the summer for sure. So he's definitely one that stood out for me through the season. Then outside of him, again, Villa, I don't think there's necessarily a star man. There's just a very good squad that's been built there by an absolutely outstanding manager. Newcastle have obviously got Isak, but again, I know he's the number 9 that scores the goals, but I think the manager and the rest of the team actually deserve a lot of credit as well. I think if you were to pick the PFA player of the year now, it probably goes to Salah. But I think it points towards what I've just said, that I'm not sure there's many other contenders outside of there, and the young player would probably maybe be Morgan Rogers. I'm not sure Gibbs-White qualifies at this point, but there's not loads of actually individuals. I just think there's lots of very good teams and teams that have been put together very well.
What great point that Dan makes, though, about the coaches, though, Darren, because it's not even the top coaches, because two of the coaches that have dominated, or at least been there and abouts in the conversation of the Premier League this season, have been Ange Postecoglou for his sins and Ruben Amorim
Leave him
for
alone,
his sins.
mate.
Well, does Ruben Amorim speak like that, Tim? No, I thought it was the other one that was the Greek Australian. No, but Darren, I mean, the drama of those two teams, I think Dan encapsulated it. You know, we were talking about the teams like Bournemouth and everything. There is a narrative that comes with them, but the drama of these two, it's almost Shakespearean. I go for Shakespeare. Tim goes for popular culture, and if the Godfather's there up there or Scarface, he'll go for that.
There's a lot of King Lear in Godfather 3.
I think you have a point. I think you're absolutely right. Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to read. You are absolutely right. Oh my word! I don't know which I'll go for first, whether watching it again or whether I'll go. I think I'll go for the Shakespeare first of all and try and find the gangster in it. But the point I'm trying to make is because you've got the drama of these two teams that should be in a better position than they are, and they keep losing. And they brought in these two managers that are, to all intents and purposes, fresh. They brought fresh critical thinking into the Football League, the Premier League, and yet we've seen what's happened to them. They have been making this season interesting, at least for those of us who are neutral.
Yeah, they have. Ange Postecoglou came with a terrific body of work. I kind of feel as though, on the one hand, he's been unlucky with injuries. On the other, he's allowed himself to get sucked into arguments around a perception of him, of his team, of the way they play, that he possibly doesn't need to have. I think he's a good manager, and good managers can have bad seasons. That's happened before. It will happen again. And I really do hope he goes on to win the Europa League, because he's had a tough old time with Spurs. I think as far as Amram is concerned, I can't remember a manager I've been more disappointed by after all the hype around him, because the good managers, even if a team can't play the way you want it to, you have to have another way to play. And I think what he has tried so often to do is shoehorn players used to a 4 at the back into a 3 at the back, and lots of players and their reputations of being casualties of that. And the club has been a casualty of that in a number of competitions and in terms of their position in the Premier League. I'm unconvinced as to whether he can make a success of Manchester United, who have a storied history playing with 4 at the back. If I'm not mistaken, only one team has ever won the league in the Premier League history with 3 at the back, and that's Chelsea under Conte. And even that season, the players wanted to play initially with a 4. So yeah, Amram, I'm really disappointed by. Came with a huge reputation, did great things, quite rightly, at Sporting, but at Manchester United, I just wonder if Liverpool, who took a long look at Amram, might be breathing a sigh of relief, because look, it really is remarkable to see what has happened at Manchester United.
I think Dan makes it's a terrific point that so many of the stars in the Premier League are the coaches. The great individual talent, certainly from a South American point of view, is still more attracted to Real Madrid and Barcelona. But it's a club that we've only just mentioned for the first time today, Chelsea. The fella who's come in the summer, Estevan, he's only just turning 18. But he is, and he's the most talented thing that Brazilian football has produced since Neymar. He's an exceptional talent. Quite how that's going to go initially at Chelsea, I don't know, but it introduces a wider thing. There's a lot of talent there. What do we think about Chelsea's chances for next season?
Dan, do you want to go first?
I mean, I find it so hard to work Chelsea out. You can have phases where you think, actually, they might know what they're doing here. Maybe they're onto something, and then other times where I think, well, it just can't work. That they've done too much. It's not going to work. Just bringing in all these young players. I just don't think they've got the manager. I don't know whether Maresca will be there next season. I guess much will depend on whether they get Champions League football or not. I know the noise coming out of Chelsea earlier on in the season was that it wasn't dependent on that. They wanted a coach that would mould young players and that would be a head coach rather than a manager. But I've not seen too much from Chelsea this season that makes me think they're going to be anywhere near being competitors next season. It's almost as if I felt under Pochettino, they were heading in the right direction. They found something that kind of worked, and they ended the season well. And then they just ripped all that up and got rid of him and got Maresca in. And then it started quite well under Maresca, and it's almost gone the opposite way of last season, where they started well, but they faded towards the back end of the season. I just don't know that they'll ever get it right, because I think even if someone started to show the signs of doing well, I don't think the ownership's got the patience for anything to last there. And that's what makes me think they can never be serious about challenging.
I think
Darren?
Dan's spot on. Dan has basically smashed it out of the park with that, because I think Chelsea have gone from a Champions League winning mix of older and younger players into a business model where they buy young players, and for however much they've spent, they expect an ultimate return on that investment because they get to a level where they can accumulate. Now, I look at the Chelsea team and squad at the moment, and I cannot see a team that will trouble the scores for the Premier League. I'd even be surprised if they made it into next season's Champions League, because I see better constructed teams and more consistent teams in that top 7 than Chelsea. I think I question whether the talents like Estevao will be able to fulfill their potential in the fractured, disruptive, unhappy climate that there appears to be there at the moment. They've spent around £1 billion. They don't have a prolific striker at the moment. And one player you, Tim, will know a lot about is Thiago Silva. What an influence he could have been, and a barometer for the culture of English football for a young player like Estevao to learn from, a reference point for the places he's going to go, the football he's going to play, the football he can expect to come up against. And they let somebody like him go. And that's Chelsea's big mistakes, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Had they kept some of those experienced talents, you look at where some of them have gone. Havertz is challenging for the league with Arsenal. Jorginho's there too. There've been other players who, Kovacic went to Manchester City and has won the league since being there. There are players that they allow to leave who still have so much football in their legs. And for that reason, I do fear for Maresca, and I don't think Chelsea will be up there near the top next season.
Lots to think about on that one. Because we're back there to something I raised earlier on, which is the business side. What are they about?
Well, what are the clubs trying to do? What are the people who own the clubs? What is their objective from the whole thing? And we wondered with Arsenal for a fair while, especially building a stadium and then the financial crisis and so on. You wonder with Arsenal if all they were about was making a profit, and I think they suffered from that maybe for a few years. And you do wonder this with the ownership structures. I mean, with Manchester United, it's clear to me that what they're mainly about is extracting money for the owners, and that's the be all and end all for them. So the business model of the owners, even with the very biggest clubs, I think is a key factor when you're analysing what are the chances for next season.
But it's also the technical considerations that you alluded to earlier on when you were talking about Bournemouth and Brighton, the model of how they managed to find the perfect coach or the perfect players that other people haven't spotted. It's all
clubs like that have no margin for error, have they? They don't have. I remember Wigan when Wigan were in the Premier League. I think it was Martinez, the coach.
Roberto Martinez when they won the FA Cup.
And they made a record signing. It was a fella from Argentina, Mauro Boselli. Now, I used to have another Premier League manager phone me up saying, should I buy him? And I said, if you even think about buying him in your sleep, you should wake up and apologise. There is just no way. There is no way. Because all he could do was just push the ball in the back of the net. He's not going to create anything. He's not quick. He's not strong. He doesn't do the channels. You create lots of chances for him and he'll score goals. But he's not joining Man City. He's joining Wigan, And he scored a grand total of 0 Premier League goals, and it effectively relegated the club. Because clubs like that, they've got no margin for error, or very, very little margin. If they get it wrong, they're going to get relegated. I think that's something which means that we're seeing in this that some of these clubs are being better run than some of the big clubs.
Yeah.
But doesn't it all become the same, though, Dan? After a while, everybody uses the same AI to, check which player is better than which and use the same algorithms, etc. That, as I understand it, was the Brighton model. They did everything on the computer to figure out if the player would be the right fit and if the coach would be the right fit. They kind of got it right most of the time, I think it's fair to say. In terms of coaches and players, have made the odd slip up. But then once all the other teams get that, going back to the original question of whether this season has been, forgettable or not, doesn't that in itself create if not it's not stagnation, but at the point where the Premier League is the most watched and most lucrative league in the world, it's got to be on the cutting edge. But do you not take the cutting edge slightly out of it when everybody uses the same models to build the club? Does that make sense? Or
yeah, it does. No, it does make sense. I work on the theory that every club is different. So just because something works for Brighton doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for Chelsea. For all intents and purposes, Chelsea have tried to be Brighton, and it hasn't worked. They've took numerous people from the backroom staff there. They obviously took the manager at one point. They've took sporting directors and people of that ilk to the club scouting. And it just hasn't worked.
There's no beach there. What do they expect?
No, exactly. They used to be on the pitch, didn't they? That was one of the things that used to get said about Stamford Bridge. So maybe they got confused, but yeah, that hasn't worked for Chelsea because Chelsea are Chelsea and Brighton are Brighton. You can all use the same tools and have the same methods, but I actually think that fundamentally every team has to be different, has to have their own way. Just because it works for one, there's no guarantees at all that it will work for the other.
That's the nature of football itself, isn't it? Because
there's no point trying to copy, is there?
Yeah, because no other sport has such a wide range of possibilities. You know, if we were talking about volleyball or something like that, there's only so many ways you can play volleyball. You know, you need lots of giant blokes, one little fella to win the ball, and then another one put it up, and one to smash it. You know,
see, I thought you were talking about beach volleyball, and I was like, huh?
Yeah. Well, if we had 3 in our team, we'd probably be cheating, I think, in beach volleyball. But why not? But football, you know, there's just so many different ways of approaching it. There's so many different models of play. And the greatest example of that is Nuno Espirito Santo. He couldn't possibly have come off at Tottenham. It just wouldn't be allowed. You know, it's not a low block counter-attack team. It can't be that way. People won't accept it. But at Forest, brilliant. So that I think means that, you know, that kind of AI approach, it obviously isn't going to produce exactly the same results because you can approach the game in so many different ways.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think as well as the AI approach, it's the decision of some clubs to do away with scouting systems as well. Whereas if you look at a club, people talk about City having so much money, and clearly their financial resources are limitless. But I think about some of the players that they signed in recent seasons where they did relatively good deals. Julian Alvarez, for example, he cost them between 14 and 17 million pounds, and he was there to be acquired. My understanding is that West Ham could have had him a season before he joined Manchester City. Marakanji was offered to a number of clubs in the Premier League who turned their noses up at him. So it isn't as if one club is doing one thing and everyone else is all following. I think the judgment at some clubs has been poor over the years, whereas at other clubs, there's been good scouting. The strike rate in terms of players fitting the style of play at the club, the ethos of the club, and getting the temperament right at certain clubs has been terrific. At Liverpool, for example, who've done so well at the top. Newcastle have been excellent at that, and Aston Villa as well, where Unai Emery's managed to get one or two players who other clubs said were bad news. I look at Disasi at Chelsea, I look at Rashford at Manchester United, and they're both effective parts of a really good team, which despite that defeat to City is on a run that I still think could take them into next season's Champions League.
Either way, Arne Slot will get the coach of the season. As we wrap up this conversation, who should get the runner-up coach of the season? I'm going to go to you last, Dan. Tim, do you fancy having a go at that?
There's lots of candidates because, as Dan has said, you know, they're the coaches have been the star turn. Obviously, part of me would love to give it to Ange Postecoglou, but I can't really. That would be flying in the face.
That voice, you can't. Absolutely not, actually.
But the turnaround of Villa under Emery is, I think it's so good to have Britain's second city represented strongly, you know, and Birmingham is, I think, the second city, and it's suffered historically from having an excess of clubs in comparison with we'd say Manchester or Liverpool. But for me, it's great to see Villa. I grew up with the idea of Villa being they were in the 3rd division when I first got interested in football, but I saw them as European champions, and that's for me the kind of place that Villa belong. It's a leading club of our second city, and they're looking like that now, aren't they, under Emery? So I think I'll go with him.
Although Darren, as we speak now, he hasn't won anything, whereas the Newcastle manager has won something, and we wish him well, of course. But then there are other, we mentioned Iraola earlier on, and I would challenge anybody to rule him out of being certainly the second most effective, if nothing else, manager of the season. Well, maybe effective is not the right word, but anyway, who would you go for apart from Arne Slot being the manager of the season?
Yeah, I do agree with Arne Slot. It's so hard to go and be the next one in. You're supposed to be the transitional one. You're not supposed to be the one. And if you look at Manchester United, who have struggled without Sir Alex, and Arsenal struggled without Arsene Wenger. In the latter days, they struggled with Arsene Wenger, but I'm sure you get the point. I think behind Slot, it would... These debates I actually hate having before the season has ended, because you can call one person and someone else might do something amazing, and then you think, if only we'd waited. I still think at the
wait
time
until the Europa League's over.
Well, indeed. Although, to be fair, either one of those managers, even if they were to win the Europa League, they would not have had a good season. So those two I could rule out, to be fair. I would go with you, though, Tim. Unai Emery has not just changed our perception of individual players, who I've mentioned earlier. He's also changed our perception of Aston Villa as a club. The performance against PSG, I think, across both legs, has made a few players sit up and take notice across European football. I think they earned the respect of a lot of people. I think the 2 goals that PSG conceded was the first time they'd let 2 in for around about a year in all competitions. And that was some going for Aston Villa, and spoke to the way that he's electrified that attack and revitalised Asensio, who wasn't getting a game, of course, at PSG, and Rashford, who everyone had written off as a busted flush. So, yeah, I think on a number of metrics, I would give it to Unai Emery at the Villa.
Yeah, Dan, you wouldn't disagree?
I was going to disagree. Lovely to hear everyone else plug for Unai Emery.
Let's take the disagreement first, and we'll get back to Unai Emery. Where would you have gone?
I think I'd probably had Liverpool 3rd at the start of the season, so I look at it as being a jump of 2 places of where I expected them to be. Although it's obviously very, very impressive what Slot's done. I think I'd have to go for Nuno, because even if they don't get Champions League, Forest getting European football of any form through the league, I never would have foreseen coming at the start of the season. In fact, I maybe wouldn't have even predicted Nuno to last the season. I think he stabilised them last year, kept them up, which was the remit. I think he's worked with that group of players, created a really good group, found a system that suits them, worked new players that have come into that system. Someone like Elliot Anderson's been a brilliant signing, even though he cost 35 million. And I think he's kind of got a team playing above themselves more than anyone else. So I think even if Forest were to get Europa League or Europa Conference League, I don't think anyone was calling Forest to get European qualification at the start of the season. And if they get Champions League, then personally, I'd put him above Slot.
Yeah. No disagreements there, or Darren?
I would disagree with that. I mean,
that's fine.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole nature of football. We be in the pub having lemonade and disagreeing. But I just think that it is, as I said before, it is so hard to do what Slot has done. Yeah. Not only has he won the league, but he has come in and he has followed someone who's been charismatic. He's been dominant. He has had a city eating out of its hand, out his hand. And he's followed that just by being his own man with the same squad.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, he's brought Chiesa in, but he's revitalized those players. the hardest thing, it's always been said, the hardest thing to do in the Premier League, well, just in football, elite football, is to get millionaires to run fast. And yet he has managed to inspire and motivate those players. And yeah, you've seen the precedents.
I was wondering which millionaires you were talking about who can run, and then I remembered. Oh yes, of course. Look, we've got to wrap up the conversation, but before we do, as we started out trying to figure out whether this was the best or the worst Premier League season ever, can we round it off by just, if I can go around the table, if you don't mind? I know it's the kind of thing you do for broadcasting, but nevertheless, give me one reason, just one reason why this season was not the worst season ever, because all three of you seem to be suggesting it wasn't. So one reason, Tim, do you want to kick off?
The unsurmountable difficulty that the promoted clubs had to survive. They clearly saw that what they'd done in the Championship was totally unable to keep them in the Premier League, which to me is a testament of the quality of the league.
Darren Lewis?
The competitiveness of the mid-ranking teams, which is kind of predicated next season. I think this season's Premier League is regenerating into even more of, that's not grammatically correct. This will become an even bigger behemoth because the mid-ranking teams are getting stronger as well. It's been an entertaining spectacle to watch.
And Darren Bardell?
I will say the coefficient that has enabled it to be one extra team qualifying for the Champions League via the Premier League has made sure that there is something very, very exciting going into the tail end of the season. So I don't think it will go down as the worst. And the worst season for me in Premier League history will always be the season Villa went down on 17 points. So nothing's ever going to be worse than that.
Yeah, you don't forget those ones. Thank you, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure having you both with us. Dan Bardell, broadcaster and Villa fan, and newly married broadcaster and Villa fan, we should add as well. Thank your wife from us all for allowing you the freedom for taking the ball and chain off you for a moment so that you could join us. It is a ball and it is a chain. And Darren, thank you very much. Darren Lewis, assistant editor of the Daily Mirror as well. Let's do it again, guys.